Keeping your API client code updated whenever there's a change in the backend REST APIs and models is tedious and error-prone as a front-end developer. A better way would be if the API client code was kept updated automatically so you have one less thing to worry about. In today's tutorial, you will learn how to supercharge your React or React Native apps by automating your entire network layer with the power of code generation from any REST API with Swagger definitions. You will learn how to generate the API client code by building a to-do app in React Native that fetches the Swagger definitions and generates the entire API client for you. You will even learn how to create the backend REST API and its Swagger definitions for the to-do app to generate the client API from. This may seem complicated, but it's actually much easier than it looks because there's an amazing code generation tool from Swagger that makes our lives much easier. If you're new here, like and subscribe and follow along with the full written tutorial on my website andreasludemann.com. So let's first understand what is Swagger and what can we do with it. It's essentially a tool for the backend to describe REST APIs. With the tool, you can very easily create interactive human-readable API documentation. The documentation is even hosted on a web page where you can see all the different endpoints and models and invoke them as well. And with this fully fledged documentation, we can pull it all down to the front end in a JSON format and invoke our code generation tool with the JSON in order to create all the models and functions we need to interact with the API. So the first thing we need to do is to prepare our API by installing Nest.js. Once that's done, we can go ahead and use the Nest.js CLI tool to create a new project by running nest new to-do API. Once our project for our API is fully set up, it's time to install Swagger in our project by running yarn add nest.js Swagger. The first we are going to create is the to-do controller for our API. So we create a to-do folder, and inside we create the to-do controller.ts file. And to do this, we first define a class that we call to-do-controller. We import the controller decorator from Nest.js, and in here we create the first endpoint. We will call it getToDos, which we will use to fetch our to-do items, and apply the get decorator from Nest.js to define a get endpoint. The return value from this endpoint is going to be a to-do response array that we are yet to define. Next, we will define the other endpoint called getToDoById, which is going to take a string called ID as a parameter that we'll use to search for the correct to-do item and return that. So that means our endpoint is just going to return a single to-do response. Next, we'll go ahead and define the actual to-do response by creating a to-do.dto.ts file. In here, we'll create a class called to-do response. It's going to take an ID string, a name string, and a description string, and a boolean called isCompleted. So now we can go ahead and import the to-do response in our controller. Since we're not going to create any database in this tutorial, we are instead just going to return two hard-coded to-do items as an array that we define in a to-do mock.ts file. Now we can go ahead and use these mocked to-do items in our to-do controller. Now we can go ahead and actually describe our API with Swagger by using the various decorators that it provides. First, we'll define the API tags that we call to-dos, which is going to be reflected in the URL for our endpoints. Next, we add an API operation to each of our endpoints that will describe what they do, as well as an API OK response for each of them, including their return types. Now that our controller is fully described with Swagger, we can go ahead and describe our to-do model using the API property decorator from Swagger. We will add this to each of the different properties and add a description for each of them. Now, to actually integrate our newly created endpoints, we need to create a module. So let's create a to-do module.ts file. In here, we will define the to-do module where we import our to-do controller. This to-do module we just created can now be imported in the app module for our project. Now it's time to enable Swagger in our project through the main.ts file. In here, we'll define a document builder to configure how the Swagger definition is going to be built, and we'll configure it with a title and a version and call build on it. So now that we have defined a configuration for our Swagger document, we can call create document to actually create the document, and we'll pass it an option called operation ID factory to basically only use the method name we created for the endpoint name without a controller prefix. And lastly, we just need to run setup with our document and a path to where our documentation should be hosted. Once our project is set up, let's go ahead and commit our changes and push it to GitHub. To actually host our new API, we can use Heroku and create a new project in here. First you give it a name, then you select a region, and then you press create app. Once the Heroku app is created, we can go ahead and connect our GitHub account and find the actual repository for our API. Then we press connect, and then we select the branch that we want to deploy and press deploy branch. Once it's deployed, we can go to our base URL, type in API/v1/todos, and actually get the JSON back from our get-todos endpoint. And to see the Swagger documentation we created, we can go to /docs and find a website where our entire API is described. Now we'll go ahead and configure the actual React Native app to interact with our API. First, we installed the OpenAPI code generation tool as a dev dependency in our project. Let's go ahead and create a scripts folder with the generate API.sh file inside. This is a shell script where we will first define the path for our Swagger documentation and then invoke the code generation tool with our Swagger documentation and tell the tool to generate the code with TypeScript and Axios, and lastly define the path for our generated API. Now we will set up a command in our package.json file to trigger the code generation script. So now we can run the script by running yarn generate API. So now we can see that the tool has created a source/generated API folder with our entire API client code inside that we can use to interact with our API. So let's go ahead and use the generated API in our app. We'll do that by creating an API folder and an index.ts file. Here we will import Axios and set up an Axios instance as well as our base path for our API and use all of that to instantiate our todos API from the generated API. If you want to, you can install .env and use that to make an environment variable for the base path to the API if you have more than one environment. So let's set up a screen for the to-do app. We'll create a screens with a to-do screen inside. We'll just create a view with an orange background color for now. And in our app.js file, we will display our to-do screen and make sure that it's showing correctly. So now we can move on. With calling our API, we'll do that by using React Query. So we will create a React Query folder inside our API folder, and in here we'll create a query client. We will simply do this by instantiating the query client from React Query and give it some basic options for the cache time and the stale time. Next, we'll set up the query client provider in the app.js file and pass the query client we just created. Now we will set up a query key that we'll call todos that we'll use whenever we fetch new to-do items. Now let's use React Query to set up a hook that we call use todos. We use the use query hook from React Query, and in here we will invoke the get todos from the todos API. And once the promise is resolved, we will return the data. And for the return value of our hook, we'll return the todos as well as a loading property for our query. So now we can actually start calling our API from our to-do screen. We will do that by first importing our use todos hook and use the loading property to display an activity indicator if it's still loading. If the data is ready, we can go ahead and describe how a to-do item should be displayed. We'll use the map operator on the to-dos array, and for a to-do item, we'll define a view, and to make each to-do element unique, we will use the to-do ID as a key and set up the wrapper for a to-do item. Now we will display the text of the to-do item by creating a text wrapper and use the text element to display the name and the description of a to-do item. Now we'll space the text out from the actual status of the to-do item. And lastly, we can display the status of the to-do item simply using emojis. And there we go. As we can see, our to-do items are correctly fetched from our API using the generated API client code. I have shown you how to supercharge your frontend with code generation of your entire API client code. Comment below if you found this helpful. There's still a lot you can do to speed up your development workflow even further. I shared with you in my last video exactly how to create pipelines using EAS to automatically deploy your React Native apps internally or to production, so make sure you check that one out if you missed it. And subscribe if you haven't already to see more videos that will take your front-end development workflow to the next level. I hope this video helped you, and I will see you in the next one.